Talk to me. Talk to me. I love the things you say. Talk to me. Talk to me in your own gentle way.
Welcome, New Mexico, around the country and around the world. If you're listening, I'm your host, MK, and you are listening to Dialogue, KSFR's Friday evening talk show where the conversation starts with you. I hope all of you had a wonderful week, and I always want to begin by saying thank you for listening. It's an honor to have you tune in, not just this week, but any and every week, right here on KSFR 101.1 FM. In his new book entitled Resisting Illegitimate Authority, A Thinking Person's Guide to Being an Anti-Authoritarian, Strategies, Tools, and Models, author Bruce Levine cites humanity's fatal flaw as its capacity to comply with abusive authority. Fortunately, there are anti-authoritarians, people comfortable questioning the legitimacy of authority and resisting its illegitimate forms. And he profiles a variety of these well-known individuals while giving those of us who can also relate some coping skills to embrace, honor, and nurture our own inner anti-authoritarian. Many of our society's historical rebels have been regularly scorned, shunned, financially punished, psychopathologized, criminalized, and even assassinated. He profiles a full variety of rebels, from Thomas Paine to Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X, Lenny Bruce, and Noam Chomsky, to name only a few, in order to glean useful lessons from their lives and provide political, spiritual, philosophical, and psychological tools to help those suffering violence and vilification in a society whose most ardent cheerleaders for, quote, freedom, unquote, are often its most obedient and docile citizens. He discusses anti-authoritarian approaches to depression, relationships, and parenting. And he makes it clear that far from being a disease, which it can often be categorized as, disobedience may be our last hope. Welcome, Bruce Levine. It's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Great to be with you, MK.
So I am curious. This is the kind of book, I have to let the readers know, that you don't want to put down, and you want to share with as many friends as you know will truly appreciate it. And I'm sure in today's day and age, there are many people who would appreciate it. And for me, I know it almost felt like it was, we talk about getting in touch with your inner child, and I felt like, oh, this is sort of like getting in touch with your inner anti-authoritarian self. So it was very interesting to see the plethora of rebels that you profiled through history and all the different challenges that they had in all the different ways that they encountered challenges. I'm curious, what brought you to write this book in terms of your own journey with coming to terms with anti-authoritarianism?
Well, there's a lot of sources to how this book came around. I've just always been interested in this group of people who refuse to unquestionably obey authority, and they've just been fascinating for me historically, but also fascinating for me in terms of clientele of people that I've known who've been diagnosed with psychiatric issues. I think totally, ridiculously, that they were like just having to deal with doctors who were more authoritarian, who demanded unquestioning obedience, or families who demanded that, and so these people created tension. So one of the more immediate precursors to this book was as an article I wrote in 2012 called "Why Anti-Authoritarians Are Diagnosed as Mentally Ill," and it was republished on tons of websites, and on some websites, I think Alternet ran it as "Would We Have Drugged Up Einstein?" And so what was interesting for me was there's been a few articles over the years that I have gotten I guess what you would call viral, over 1 million viewers, but more than any article that has really gotten a lot of viewers in terms of getting email from this article. I just got tons. I mean, this 2012 article, and I still to this day, every couple of weeks get somebody saying, wow, this explains why I was diagnosed with mental illness, or why my kids were diagnosed with mental illness, that they really just were anti-authoritarians. And so that's one of the things that really prompted me to say, hey, look, there's an audience of people out there. Another interesting thing was there was a more mainstream book a few years back that was interesting for me about shyness, about introversion. This is Susan Cain's book on quiet, where she was making the argument that there was this huge group of people out there who were forcing to pass as extroverts because our society needed to have extroverts, and so these poor introverts were being marginalized. And this book became mainstream. Why? Because it wasn't so politically incorrect, because you have a lot of people who are passing in great power in American CEOs and politicians and all that. So that book became powerful. It was interesting for me that there's a little bit of a parallel as this other group of people out there who are anti-authoritarians, who are more politically incorrect, there's not a lot of CEOs or no politicians who are anti-authoritarians, so they're really being marginalized. And so for me, I felt the need to really talk about these folks and care about them and give them some understanding of what it takes to survive.
Why do you think right now is a particular moment in time for this particular book?
Well, I think it's really interesting because the mainstream media is more and more talking about this issue of authoritarians. So for everybody, this idea, given Trump, who is what I would consider in your face, almost a caricature of a authoritarian strongman. And maybe I should define these terms here for your audience. So authoritarians just really means somebody who demands unquestioning obedience to authority, and authoritarian subordinates accept that. They accept that unquestioning obedience to authority, and authoritarians in power demand that unquestioning obedience. And people who are anti-authoritarians are folks who are not necessarily anti-authority, but they question whether an authority is legitimate or not, whether an authority is honest or exploitative, somebody you can trust. And if an anti-authoritarian assesses an authority to be illegitimate, not legitimate, they will resist that authority. So we have, in a case of Trump, one of the first times in American history, we have a sort of in-your-face authoritarian. And so it's interesting for me because we've had many other authoritarian presidents as I go through many Democratic presidents. You have people like Woodrow Wilson, who reverses himself from being, saying we're not going to get into World War I, to all of a sudden when he wins because of corporate interests, we're going to be involved here, and all of a sudden he's basically says well, the First Amendment goes out the window, and they start to jail and imprison anybody who's just speaking out against the war. I mean, you have famous people like Eugene Debs just getting thrown in prison for giving an anti-war speech because of Wilson. You have people like Emmer Goldman being deported. So you have other authoritarian eras. You have other authoritarian presidents. So you've had other authoritarian kinds of presidents, but never before have we had this guy. So it's motivated even the mainstream to start to think about authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism.
Yeah, and there are a number of words that you help clarify in your book. And again, as you did at the beginning of this interview, you were talking about the difference between authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism. Would you like to comment on some of the other words that you clarify in your book as a means of kind of helping people make their way through these words and what they actually even mean?
Right. So one of the points that I make is not all non-compliant people are anti-authoritarians, all right? So there are some people who reject all authority. They're just anti-authority in general. And one of the points that I make that even anarchists, people like Noam Chomsky, people like Bakunin, talk about the fact that there's a difference between legitimate authority and illegitimate authority. So, for example, Noam Chomsky gives the example of a kid running into traffic and an authority, an adult, stopping that kid from doing that, and that is a legitimate authority, as opposed to what he also makes the point, most of the authorities in our society have to do with maintaining a power structure here, and he would view them as unjustified, morally unjustified, and illegitimate authority. So we're all making subjective judgments about what's a legitimate authority or an illegitimate authority, but it's very different to be, to oppose all authority, and, is not what an anti-authoritarian does. They're assessing whether an authority is legitimate or not, and then they have the courage and the guts to challenge and resist it. Another important distinction is between somebody who is contrarian. Now, a contrarian is also non-compliant, but the contrarian is just really opposing what's popular, and so they may be opposing a war that's popular or being for a war that's not that popular. So they're so there's different kinds of people who are non-compliant. There's people, young kids, for example, who are oppositional. They may just you tell them one thing and they're always no, and they're just oppositional. And from my point of view, a lot of these kids create tension, and a lot of these kids have the courage to assert themselves and be oppositional, and eventually they mature into being something more than just oppositional. They move into being able to assess who's a legitimate authority to be taken seriously versus an illegitimate authority, and they become anti-authoritarians. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book, and I talk about a lot, is that my fear is that a lot of these young kids who are just oppositional, who could mature into anti-authoritarians, which we really need to have in a democratic society, they're being drugged and medicated away to the point where they'll never achieve any political consciousness.
That's why I thought this was very interesting, because as a therapist, you have the background in understanding a variety of these different disorders. Do you want to talk about these so-called disorders that to you sort of ring off alarm bells in saying, wait a minute, hold on, this may not be a disorder. This might be actually the sign of a thinking, feeling, paying attention human being. Do you want to speak to some of those diagnoses?
It's really important, maybe not so much for your audience. They might be more hip to this, but it's real important for America to realize that these DSM, the American Psychiatric Association's publication of diagnostic manuals, has nothing to do with science. It's all about culture and politics, and that's why homosexuality up until 1973 was a mental illness, and it was finally removed because of political activism. And so what you end up having in that DSM it sort of mirrors a culture and a society. And so as 1980 happens and we have move into a more authoritarian era in America, where you have Ronald Reagan becoming president, this past governor of California who gained fame by being after being an actor, by being a strong man, putting down student revolts. So you have this 1980 more authoritarian America, same year that the DSM-3 comes out, and you have something called oppositional defiant disorder becoming just created as a mental illness. Nothing to do with science. It's just created culturally and politically. And the symptoms of this so-called illness, ODD, have nothing to do even with breaking the law. These kids are not juvenile delinquents. These kids are kids who the symptoms are often arguing with adults, often refusing to comply with adults. So this is happening when I'm in graduate school, and I'm just going, this is embarrassing. I'm now moving into a profession that is really increasingly embarrassing. And so what's happened over the years is, unfortunately, unlike homosexuality, not only are this ODD still an illness, but these kids have become increasingly drugged and medicated. So you take a look at ODD is one of the disruptive behavioral, so-called the disruptive behavioral disorders, and of that group, when you take a look at kids who are being put on antipsychotic drugs, the heavily tranquilizing drugs like Seroquel, Risperdal, Zyprexa, there's more of these kids who are being labeled with these disruptive disorders being put on these drugs than kids who are being labeled psychotic. But that's only one obvious area where disobedience, noncompliance is being pathologized. Just another area, a little bit more subtle. But if you work with a lot of anti-authoritarians who are being, increasingly anxious and depressed, if you're an anti-authoritarian and you're talking to them, you realize that, of course, nothing this has to do with chemical brain imbalance. This is all mumbo-jumbo theories put out by drug companies to be able to sell their drugs. We could talk about that later. But if you talk to a lot of anti-authoritarians who are anxious and depressed, a lot of the pain of their life is this idea that they know that if they comply to illegitimate authorities, they lose integrity, they feel humiliated, or if they rebel against those illegitimate authorities, they know they risk marginalization, financial marginalization, social marginalization, career marginalization, and so they're caught in a quandary. And you can see this clearly if you are an anti-authoritarian, but most mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, are not. So they just take a look at these symptoms of anxiety and depression, and they just label them with some mental illness and drug them.
Yeah, there's two things I learned in your book: that I am an anarchist and now proud of it, and And I'd like you to define that later for others, because I've always thought of anarchists as being these sort of stereotypes of chaotic people that don't really believe in order, but in fact it's the opposite. Actually, if you want to comment on that now, can you?
Sure. One of the points that I make in the book, all genuine anarchists are anti-authoritarians. But I also talk about a lot of people in the book who are anti-authoritarians who are not anarchists at all. So that's one point. So what is really an anarchist, okay? Now, it varies, okay? There's different people, anarchists don't have a monolithic definition. But certainly none of them believe in illegitimate authority. None of them believe in coercion. That's really important. And they believe in mutual aid. They don't believe in hierarchy. And so they don't believe this is an authoritarian view of anarchists is they believe in chaos and violence. This is just completely the opposite. Many anarchists out there do not believe in chaos. They believe that you can organize yourself in non-hierarchical manners, and that's actually been 99% of human history. Indigenous people a lot of these folks have organized themselves in less hierarchical manners, and we have workplace workplace non-hierarchies. The folks who published my book, there's a significant publisher called AK Press who published my book, and they are a non-hierarchical. There's no top dog there in AK Press. They all work together. So that's anarchy is a belief that you don't need to have hierarchy. You don't need to have you don't need to coerce people. You can help each other through mutual aid. So that's what anarchism is about. Now there have been some anarchists who've been so frustrated and so upset they've moved into violent behaviors to try to change the political system. There have been some famous anarchists like that, but anarchism itself has nothing to do with violence. It certainly has nothing to do with chaos.
Right, and I'm the one of the peaceful sort. But I just want to clarify that for the listeners in case. And so let's go back to this idea about the therapist as being. You said that that some of these kids will actually these anti-authoritarian kids will go to therapists who then are not anti-authoritarians and won't be able to recognize them. What do you call somebody who follows the authoritarian? Is that just another authoritarian?
Yes. I mean, part of the definition that for an authoritarian in control demands unquestioning obedience, and an authoritarian subordinate will provide that unquestioning obedience. And so if you have anybody involved in any kind of authoritarian organization, whether it's the mafia or nowadays, I suppose, the Democratic Party. I mean, like people who just are terrified that if they don't, or the Republican Party or the Ku Klux Klan, anybody who's terrified to challenge and resist what they would consider to be illegitimate authority, they're authoritarians as well. So authoritarians are both in control and their followers. So I don't know if that helps you.
Yeah, it does. In fact, I'm curious then, would you say that overall the mental health system is made up of authoritarians?
Yes, and that was part of the thing that was really one of the reasons that I stayed in the profession was I felt the need to report that to the general public. That one of the shocking things for me was here I was going to school, being a fairly, I mean, if you get good enough grades in high school and college to get into a PhD program for clinical psychology. I mean, I considered myself fairly compliant relative to a lot of I mean, I grew up working class, and so I grew up with a lot of kids who just said the heck with high school, and they dropped out, or they dropped out of college, and they were much more resistant or rebellious than I certainly was. And here I go to graduate school, and I discover that I'm in this atmosphere where if I'm just questioning the legitimacy of something like the DSM or something like IQ testing, that all of a sudden these guys are labeling me with things like having issues with authority, that I stood out. And that was sort of amusing for me because at some level here I was being viewed as a bad boy, and I had never been viewed that way. But at some other level it was very troubling for me because I thought, like, wow, if you're viewing me as having issues with authority, being some kind of bad boy, what are you viewing the other kind of folks that I grew up with who just really didn't like school? They were smart kids, and but they blew it off. What are you going to do to those kids? Well, I find out they're all getting labeled with, ADHD. They're getting labeled with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, with oppositional defiant disorder, and on and on and on. Why is that? Because the group of folks who become mental health professionals, with exceptions, but the majority of folks are being selected and socialized to comply with authority, and therefore they see anybody who resists authority as being something problematic with them. Now, again, there are exceptions. I think I know every dissonant psychiatrist and psychologist in the United States, and trust me, it is a small minority of people in organizations like the International Society for Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry, small group of dissonant anti-authoritarian mental health professionals, but because most of them have been marginalized. Most of them have had a tough way to go career-wise, and it's cost them financially, because the population itself of mainstream mental health professionals is a group of people who are more authoritarian and completely without any awareness of it.
When I first heard the term oppositional defiance disorder, which I just heard a few years ago, I thought, what? What is that? And I thought to myself, well, if that exists, I am that. Yeah, sure, go ahead and label me with that, because
right.
There's very little that I don't question. It's just, I call it critical thinking.
Right, and I think that's a really, when I bring up that term, oppositional defiance disorder, even to some mainstream broadcasters, mainstream journalists, they chuckle. And but here it is, my mental health profession, nobody was chuckling, nobody was laughing. People were taking this idea seriously. It wasn't completely obvious to them that, yeah, these kids were a handful. These kids were kids who were stubborn, handful kids. These were kids who were not easy, but they were not mentally ill, you know?
Yeah, that's why I appreciated what you were doing in your book, because you're demedicalizing this way of thinking and putting it into the context of history via normal, regular people, and not just normal, regular people, but people we would actually call heroes and who have changed the course of history, and without their critical thinking skills would not have been able to do so. But can you pick out maybe some of your favorite and talk about the different varieties of anti-authoritarian thinkers throughout history?
You know, a guy who's, in terms of what we've been talking about, who's interesting for me is Malcolm X, who, you know, some folks might not know as a kid, before his family got ripped apart after his father was murdered by a white supremacist group, and, you know, police claimed it was an accident, insurance companies said it was suicide, so they wouldn't pay. So his mother becomes, you know, the whole family gets destroyed by by financial stress. His mother ends up in a psychiatric hospital long term, and so Malcolm X changes. He becomes a very angry young guy who's predatory, criminal, moves into stealing and robbing, and ends up getting thrown in prison. And then he has another transformation in prison where he becomes part of the Nation of Islam, which is a fairly authoritarian organization. And then he has another transformation where he realizes again, this guy, this leader, Elijah Muhammad, is an illegitimate authority. He's breaking the laws of. He's a predatory guy who's, you know, having sex with secretaries in the organization. He's a guy who's not a legitimate authority, and he breaks with him, and he knows that's going to cost him. They're going to put a hit out on him. He knows the way they work. It's almost like, you know, the mob, and he knows he's going to get assassinated, especially since he's going to forget about getting any help from the U.S. government or FBI or CIA, who would like him dead too. So, and he moves into more and more of a political guy. At the end of his life, he's rebelling against and speaking out against capitalism and imperialism. And he has this transformation into being an anti-authoritarian guy. And one of the points that I make was, if you take a look at, here's Malcolm X in his teens, here's an African-American guy, his family getting ripped apart, gets thrown into foster care, becomes disruptive. What would happen to a kid like that today? I guarantee you, if he got in the hands of psychiatry, he would be put on antipsychotic drugs for conduct disorder, disruptive behavioral disorder. And so the whole arc of his life is changing, and that's happening. There's a young Malcolm X right there, out there, who's being put on antipsychotic drugs here. And so that's one interesting guy for me. And I talk about a lot of other people now who are idolized and viewed as heroes as America. Thomas Paine, who was an anti-authoritarian, who was a hero in the 1770s because he challenges the illegitimate authority of British rule, and, you know, he becomes a big guy. But then he goes on to challenge other illegitimate authorities, including George Washington. That's one long story. But he also writes this book called The Age of Reason, where he challenges the illegitimate authority of organized religion, including Christianity, and he becomes a pariah. And a lot of Americans don't know this. In the last 10 years of his life, he is just he's shunned by everybody. He can't even get a room in an inn, and actually for the whole 1800s, throughout the whole 19th century, he is a pariah even among, after he's dead, and in the 1880s, Teddy Roosevelt's calling him a filthy little atheist. He is somebody who only his reputation gets revived much later because people have conveniently forgotten, including you see these people who are right-wing Christian fundamentalists talking about how great Thomas Paine is. It's sort of comical because they've completely ignored the fact that he wasn't an atheist, by the way, he was a deist, but he spoke out against the illegitimate authority of organized religion. He couldn't stop himself. For Thomas Paine, everywhere he saw illegitimate authority, he spoke out against it, and ultimately it leads to marginalization. So one of the things, I have a chapter about people now who are looked up as very highly, but really in the time of their death, including Malcolm X, they're pariahs in American society. And it was important for me, for people who are anti-authoritarians, to know that there's a great price to be paid, that the United States may celebrate some anti-authoritarians from the past, but even during the time of their life, they have a tough way to go. And so what's going to happen if you're an anti-authoritarian in the United States? Authoritarians are going to try to ignore you. If they can't ignore you, they're going to criminalize you, they're going to psychopathologize you, medicalize you, or they're going to financially marginalize you. And so you're going to have a hard way to go here, because it's a myth here, although certainly the United States is not the most authoritarian society out there. It is historically been authoritarian, with a couple of eras a little bit different, like the 1770s, 1960s. But even during these eras, if you were a real, genuine anti-authoritarian, it was hard to survive and flourish. So I wanted to get that a point across and talk about some of the things that people do. I don't romanticize anti-authoritarians, because some of the folks move into problematic, destructive behaviors, violent behaviors that does not do themselves or the cause of anti-authoritarian any good. But some folks do move into more triumphant anti-authoritarian lives, and I wanted to talk about what they did. Some of it was luck, but they also acted with some wisdom as well.
Can you talk about that? Can you expound on what some of those skills are, or ways that people can think about channeling their anti-authoritarianism toward positive end and where it can actually be used as a means of triumph?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things as a psychologist, or anybody, can sort of understand when you're an anti-authoritarian and you're resisting illegitimate authority, which you view as unjust, and you're getting ignored, you get a lot of anger. And this is a big thing that gets people into a lot of trouble. So you see, for example, as a group, the Weathermen in the late 1960s, they had tried to peacefully, through the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, to try to end this insane Vietnam War. It was completely ineffective. And there's this kind of thing that happens to people when they move into feeling that they're totally impotent, they have this rage over being ignored, that they can move into violence. And unfortunately, you see in the case with those guys, they move into bombings, and what happens? A couple of years later, Nixon gets reelected on 1972 in a landslide with law and order. And so historically in America, what happens is if authoritarians can bait some anti-authoritarians into violent behavior, it gives them even more ammunition for a society to want to give them more power, and you have a more authoritarian society. And so you see, I talk about some other kind of famous anti-authoritarians, the anarchist Alexander Berkman, who attempts to assassinate a guy named Frick, who's leading the Homestead strike there. He's a management stooge picked by Carnegie, and again, this anger, this frustration ends up in some ways subverting the strike. The strike had more popular appeal before he attempted to assassinate this guy. After he attempts to assassinate Frick, who is viewed more as a villain, after he survives this assassination attempt, he gets more sympathy, and so it ends up being a problematic blow, not only for that strike, but also for anarchism in general. I mean, one of the reasons that the popular press has been able to label anarchism as this violent thing is because of a guy like Alexander Berkman. And so I talk about other folks like that and then there's other anti-authoritarians I talk to who are some of my heroes, people like Phil Oakes, who was this pop political folk singer in the 1960s, who, because he's overwhelmed by pain, moves into self-destructive behaviors. And part of the reasons that he moves into that are substance abuse. A lot of anti-authoritarians don't move into violence. I mean, move into self-destructive behaviors, again, because they're so overwhelmed with anger and pain for a variety of reasons, some of which being ignored, some of which is they pick the wrong folks to hang out with, and they move into, ultimately, in Phil Oakes' case, hanging himself when he's in his 30s. It was very sad. So those are some of the folks who move into problematic behaviors, but the other part is I have a whole section of like 8 folks who move into more triumphant lives. So I talk about some what I consider more triumphant anti-authoritarians, from Henry David Thoreau, to people like Frederick Douglass and Tubman and Helen Keller and Noam Chomsky and George Carlin, and some people might know about Jane Jacobs. So there are folks who actually pull it off, and they would be the first to admit some of it was luck, but some of it had to do with wisdom of what to do with their things like anger. And so they used their anger more constructively. They also had some more wisdom about things like money. So, for example, a lot of anarchists out there really are appalled by how much power money has in our society. And so they just don't know what the heck to do with it. Whereas you have somebody like Emma Goldman, who is a hardcore, clearly an anarchist, but she realized, hey, you want to survive in America, you need to have a couple of bucks in your pocket to help yourself and help your buddies. And so she learned a lot of things, from nursing to public speaking to a lot of different ways to make a dollar. And she was able to survive, and not only survive herself, but help her anarchist buddies who didn't have any money. So she was hip to that. Finances, another thing besides that, finances, knowing how to deal with your anger, was understanding the importance of relationships. So again, a lot of anti-authoritarians have so much anger and feel so uncared about, they move into problematic behaviors that leads them to being either having problematic relationships, people they're trusting they shouldn't trust, or they're totally alone in the world, and they get a little bizarre that way, being completely isolated.
And we need to take a break, so we'll be back after these short messages.
Talk to me. Talk to me.
You are listening to author Bruce Levine about his new book, Resisting Illegitimate Authority, a thinking person's guide to being an anti-authoritarian, strategies, tools, and models. And now back to the conversation. I want to go back a bit here, talking about bigotry, because you mentioned bigotry in the book, and resisting. I'm just going to read a quote out of it, because it seems to me that it's a bigotry that doesn't get talked about. It's the one bigotry that actually doesn't hit the headlines. It says, resisting illegitimate authority is about bigotry, but not about bigotry directed at race, religion, gender, or sexual preference, all of which certainly remains in the United States today. This book is about another kind of bigotry, one directed at certain personalities and temperaments, a bigotry that often goes unnoticed. And I'm wondering, would you say it doesn't only go unnoticed, would you say it actually goes purposefully ignored and subjugated?
Yes. I mean, anti-authoritarians create tension. Okay, they create tension in a family. Okay, so let's say you have, I deal with at the family level and also at the greater political level, governmental level. But an anti-authoritarian in a family setting, say you have illegitimate authority. You have a parent who's abusive, sexually, emotionally, physically abusive. It's a dysfunctional, illegitimate authority, and the anti-authoritarian in that family, that young kid is going to speak out about it. He's going to say, there's something wrong here. I don't have to take you serious. And they create tension. Just like a guy like Edward Snowden at a much bigger political level, another anti-authoritarian I talk about who's not an anarchist, probably grew up more libertarian. But Edward Snowden, here's this guy who, believed in the U.S. government. He grew up, actually enlisted, to fight in Iraq, joined the CIA, and then he realized, wow, what they're telling me in school about our government isn't true. Our government is spying on us here. They're violating the Fourth Amendment, and he moved into resisting the illegitimate authority of the U.S. government, specifically the NSA and the other security agencies, and he created a lot of tension because he said, look, not only is this at first he thought, well, it's just a George Bush administration, and he waited to see what Obama would do. He says Obama's doing the same thing. And he said, well, our government is, in terms of this, an illegitimate authority to be resisted. They're violating the Bill of Rights, of, the Constitution of the United States. And so, of course, he created a lot of tension, and what the heck they're going to do with him is to turn him into a criminal. Or the media tried to turn him into, as I give quotes about almost everybody in the media, when he does this in 2013, leaks the information that I just described. When he leaks it to the press, the media is psychopathologizing. They're calling him a narcissistic young man. They're doing all these things to him. The government tries to criminalize him, and he's still, he's arrested under the Espionage Act, and he has to flee the country. So anti-authoritarians on a family level or on the level of somebody like Edward Snowden, they're going to create tension. That's just a fact of life. And if you have a democratic society, one of the essence of a democratic society, more democratic families, you take seriously tension. You don't overreact to it. You go like, wow, if somebody's reacting with tension here, let's understand what's going on. Maybe this is an important thing we need to do something about. An authoritarian family or an authoritarian government doesn't want to deal with any tension. They just want to destroy it, get rid of it. If you can't ignore it, kill it.
Yeah, there's a quote again in your book from the scientist and novelist C.P. Snow, and he writes, and I'm taking from your book, when you think of the long and gloomy history of man, you will find more hideous crimes have been committed in the name of obedience than have ever been committed in the name of rebellion. Is this a moment where we all need to start learning to embrace our inner anti-authoritarian?
Oh, absolutely, because one of the points I make is they are it's our society. We value first responders when, like the firemen, which is great, but we anti-authoritarians are first responders too. They're first responders against illegitimate authority, and historically, most of society, most of people, they can't deal with the tension. They can't deal with what's possibly going to happen if they rebel or resist, and so you have a small minority of people who are anti-authoritarians. But you don't need a lot of them historically. If you have a significant minority of anti-authoritarians, and I talk about, Ralph Nader talks about, like, hey, everybody realized it was a bad deal to have unsafe cars, but it only took a small minority of him and people like him to start talking about it to a minority with courage, who he at the time in the 60s, willing to go to do battle against the car companies and General Motors. And it was a small minority of anti-authoritarians like himself who reflected the general will of the people, and they were able to create some change. So, authoritarians recognize that it doesn't take that anti-authoritarianism is kind of contagious, and, so if people see somebody with the courage to rebel against the legitimate authority, it'll catch on. So that's why they want to squash it all. But I should say, one of the really sad things for me becoming a psychologist, when I was interested in the profession, I knew about, like, in the 1960s, there were psychologists, people like Stanley Milgram, who did these famous studies called Obedience to Authority, which at that time in the 60s and early 50s following World War II, a lot of American psychology were concerned with the idea, could what have happened in Nazi Germany? Could the events of Nazi Germany also happen in America? Do we have that in us as well? And that's what Stanley Milgram's Obedience to Authority study showed, that, the mass majority of people were willing to comply with abusive, illegitimate authority, telling them to shock subjects, and this was a scary thing. And that was an interesting thing in the 1960s. Unfortunately, our society has become less interested in that and more caring about wanting to have a more compliant society, and that's also the case in my mental health profession, which is just generally, historically, just reflects culture and reflects society.
I'm curious to know how much you think shame enters into that picture, how much shame gets exploited or is used as a tool for oppressing the anti-authoritarians in our society.
I think shame is a hugely important thing that happens why a lot of anti-authoritarians are pathologized and diagnosed, because my experience firsthand of being around a lot of mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists when I was in graduate school is I felt they had a lot of shame about their gutlessness, about their compliance, their excessive compliance to authorities, and that so when they would see somebody out there who was non-compliant, especially if some person was being non-compliant in a way, and a youngster's not going to be super mature a lot in their non-compliance. They're going to be rash, how they're going to do things. But generally, if you're somebody who's ashamed of your inability to resist illegitimate authority, you're going to more likely pathologize and medicate folks who are anti-authoritarian. So shame is a great fuel in people being able to not see certain realities and justify what they're doing.
Yeah, and of course then when you're also labeled with a psychiatric illness, then there's also that shame that comes with that.
Right, and that's a big reason why I write this book, and a big reason why you have not only dissonant mental health professionals, but a larger group of people who are ex-patients, psychiatric survivor organizations, people who have been shamed by having these mental illness diagnoses, and it's sort of laughable that people want to, the idea that that you want to end the stigma of mental illness when the stigma of mental illness is created, in fact, by these needless mental illnesses. And so, once people in our society get labeled with a mental illness, and you can see this, mental illness terms are leveled at people as a way of invalidating them. I mean, even you can see the left and liberals. One of the ways that they want to invalidate Donald Trump is to call him mentally ill. In our society, to call somebody mentally ill is to marginalize them, is to invalidate them. And so people who have been labeled, it's sort of insult to injury. Not only have they been not needlessly or unfairly pathologized with a mental illness, and then once they get that label of mental illness, it's a source of shame that weakens them down the road. I too want to end the stigma of mental illness, but the way I want to end the stigma of mental illness is getting rid of a lot of these mental illnesses and to understand human behaviors in a very different way. That when you're taking a look, and we've just been talking about depression, anxiety, oppositional defiance disorder, but when you take a look at even these other so-called serious mental illnesses, that they're really not, that they're really aspects of our human behaviors that have been pathologized because they create a lot of tension for people.
With mental illness labels, it doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter if you're on the right or the left side of things. Once you're given that label, you are thrown to the very bottom of the rung of the hierarchy. I had this dialogue with someone the other day about homelessness, and that, was homelessness the worst place to be in our society? And I said, yeah, but you can still outgrow homelessness, and people will go from rags to so-called riches, and it's a wonderful mythology. But once you're labeled with the label so-called mental illness, you're labeled for life.
Right, I agree. It would be an interesting study, that I'm not aware of anyone ever doing. But which makes it more difficult for you to get a job in America here if you've got a record of being a felony, or you got a record of being labeled with schizophrenia? I mean, it would be interesting. My gut tells me that they would be pretty close, but that it might be that having that somebody be more willing to have an ex-felon work for them than to have somebody labeled with schizophrenia.
Yeah, and how much of this anti-authoritarianism do you think is, even if it's intuitive, I think of children within family structures, something about speaking truth to power, that the children might see the parents' weaknesses, perhaps that's threatening, or, that how much of this is kind of about exposing people's vulnerabilities or weaknesses when they don't want them to be exposed?
It's almost everything to do with that. I mean, it has to do with a fascist family or a fascist society. The more insecure parents are, the more insecure a leadership is, or in general, they don't want to deal with anything that's weak about them, that's wrong or fragile. I mean, you see this again most clearly. We come back to the caricature of an authoritarian, Donald Trump, who the guy's never made a mistake in his life, right? According to him, there's nothing nothing weak about him. Everything about him is great. You know, he's a caricature, but by the caricature, the cartoonish element of him, he sort of exposes really what a lot of kind of sort of authoritarian fascist families and fascist leadership is all about. They're so insecure that they don't want to deal with anything that's problematic. Whereas if you have a more kind of healthy, kind of structure, more functional structure, like a parent or a leader, wants to know, like, what did I do wrong here? Or even a coach, who's a more healthy coach, who says, like, did what I say, was it what I said helpful or not helpful? Or even a mental health professional, a psychiatrist. I mean, I should tell people out there, who are seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist, one of the ways easy early on that you can get a sense of, like, how authoritarian or not they are is like how open they are to hearing whether what they're doing is helpful or not helpful. And somebody who's authoritarian, they just want to hear everything that they're doing is right.
Yeah, and they may even open themselves up to being corrected.
Right. Oh, they want to be corrected. Okay. They want to do that because at the end of the day, somebody who really cares about humanity and cares about really helpful. They understand they want to open the doors to, like, they want a more collaborative relationships. They want to be corrected. They assume that they have humility. They assume that everything they're doing is not right. That they assume that that things are they might be doing are problematic. So they're putting great efforts to hear resistance, to hear challenges, to hear criticism.
I think this is one of the best books I've ever read on the topic because it's just so comprehensive. You take it from not just the mental health perspective, and that's why I appreciate it, because you really take us back into the larger society of where we are going as human beings and how we are evolving, and this role that this is playing in the future of our country. Where do you think we are going? Is it going to get worse? Are we heading toward totalitarianism? And when I say that, feel free to define that term, totalitarianism.
Well, totalitarianism is really just a kind of an authoritarian, complete authoritarian government, 1984 Orwellian, where all the government expects all subservience and obedience to everything. And I think that when you take a look at what's happening increasingly in American society, it's hard to be intellectually optimistic. Some people have this fantasy, well, if it gets bad enough, but historically it doesn't work usually like that. I mean, it's been pretty bad here in terms of what's happened to America from George W. Bush to Donald Trump. I mean, it's pretty. I mean, here you got a guy who's this in-your-face authoritarian kind of guy who a lot of folks are just think he's a little frightening figure, and you don't have that much resistance. So the idea that if it gets bad enough is just not has been historically proved. I think that one of the other things that an article I wrote in 2009, an article called "Our Americans Are Broken People," that led to another book, was I think not all Americans are completely broken, but most are, and a lot of folks too, I think want to believe that if enough dissent, that's going to do anything, and they don't grasp the fact that once you move into an authoritarian society, an authoritarian leadership doesn't care at all about dissent, and if you're too broken to refuse to cooperate, to disobey in nonviolent ways, it's not going to accomplish anything. So I can't see, intellectually a lot of hope right now that things are going to change. But what I also know historically is that there's been other times where it just didn't seem like anything was going to happen, and some things, amazing miracle kinds of things happen, and all of a sudden, like I said before, just like cowardice is contagious, courage is contagious.
So in a nutshell, would you define America as an authoritarian society?
I would. It's there's not a black and white kind of thing, and so there are certainly more authoritarian societies than the United States. I mean, certainly we're not a society where, like, I'm sitting here worried that I'm going to get a knock on the door by the FBI here, and I'm going to get thrown in a ditch and shot. Whereas others, for saying the kind of stuff that I'm saying, so there is free speech here in the United States, unlike other kinds of more draconian authoritarian societies where you were afraid to say anything. Now, it's mostly people's free speech are just ignored, which is that now. I'm sure there's nobody in the Democratic or Republican Party who's listening to your show who takes seriously, the corporatist mainstream parties in our society. So there's a continuum of things, and my concern is that, like I said, in certain eras of American society, we've had more anti-authoritarian kind of a culture, subculture, and the political leadership responded to that. So, like in the 1960s, while they didn't end the war in Vietnam, they were able to, because of the protests on the street, they ended it more because they were afraid of the military was just going to not just break apart. That's a whole other long story. But there was such an anti-authoritarian society that you were able to make some gains, like you were able to have Ralph Nader and clean air and clean water and NIOSH, and so certain things were able to happen in the 1960s, 1970s. You've had certain gains that have happened in terms of civil rights, and you've had certain eras where we've had more or less authoritarian society. Right now, for me, it feels like one of the more authoritarian societies in U.S. where you've got a situation where you've got most people want, for example, Medicare for all. Polls show that most people want to be out of these ridiculous wars, reduce military budget. Most people want to have all the money out of politics. So there's a whole long list of these things, but most people have also given up on the possibility of what the majority wants happening. That tells you got people are feeling like they're living in a pretty authoritarian society.
Yeah, and you also talk about the importance of peer support and why that is so important, and the stinking badges. We don't need these stinking badges. Can you talk about that in reference to the therapeutic world of psychiatry and mental health?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the badges is a term I use throughout the whole book as a kind of it's a badge of authority that sometimes often is illegitimate. Authoritarians are either going to try to, not allow peer support or mutual aid to happen, or if it does happen, they're going to co-opt it. And in the specific way that they co-opt peer support among folks who are ex-patients, one of the things that they've done is that the ex-patient psychiatric survivor movement has got powerful enough to be able to say, hey, look, we should be helpful. We should be involved in help with people who are going through serious emotional periods of their life. And so they've been, and eventually some of them have gotten jobs in places like in psychiatric institutions. And what's happened is that instead of them really, the folks at the top have tried to co-opt them, to try to use them, their fellow ex-patients, as a way to kind of convince and control people to be more compliant. And that, of course, is an anathema to real activist ex-psychiatric patients who their whole goal was to either reform dramatically or eliminate the whole psychiatric hierarchy and coercion. And they knew clearly that all of these badges that people had, whether they were PhDs or MDs, were often illegitimate authorities. Authoritarians often, throughout history, have given low-level badges to people who could have been potentially rebellious revolutionary folks to get them to control other folks in a group. That's one of the plays in their strategy book here to maintain control. And I've known some folks who they've done it. They've gone and they've been in a former patient. It's been distasteful and disgusting how they've been treated. So they're going to go and they become psychologists, and they're going to try to help change things. That's a tough path to go because it's you against this whole kind of controlling, socializing place that's not going to want you to do that. Or even if you somehow luckily slither through your training. It was a little easier for me a few decades ago. It's much harder now. I know some of these folks, trying to do it now. That once you get out, good luck trying to get a job, in the whole mental health world.
And Bruce, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for taking this time out of your very busy life to talk to us about your new book. The name of it is Resisting Illegitimate Authority: A Thinking Person's Guide to Being an Anti-Authoritarian: Strategies, Tools, and Models. Author Dr. Bruce Levine.